the next generation can spot authenticity from, something not even AI written, but something that is like messaged. And so what I have always tried to do on LinkedIn and on social is actually to stay true to my one narrative, which is about women. And it doesn't mean I only tell you about women in politics or women in this. I Whatever I'm talking about, that is the narrative. Like, wow, this is awesome. Like this woman got, XYZ medals at the or oh my gosh, look, this prime minister of this country changed these laws to right. So that's kind of been the baseline for me is to start by saying like, that's my thing. And so I'm always going to talk about it.
Welcome to another episode of Chief Influencer. I'm your host, Anthony Shop, co-founder of Social Driver. Let's face it, Washington is the center of influence in the US and arguably in the world. Chief Influencer features leaders who have figured out how to break through in today's fragmented and fast-changing environment. Social Driver teamed up with the Communications Board and the George Washington University College of Professional Studies to recognize these incredible leaders as chief influencers and highlight how they inspire and influence others. I am thrilled to introduce today's guest, Frederique Irwin, President and CEO of the National Women's History Museum. She is spearheading a bold transformation there to ensure women's stories take their rightful place at the center of American history. And before we dive in, here are just a few things I think that you should know about Fred. Number one, she's reimagining what a 21st century museum can be, turning the National Women's History Museum into a dynamic, digital-first institution that reaches millions of students, educators, and lifelong learners across the country. Number two, prior to this role, Fred founded herCorner, which empowered thousands of women entrepreneurs to scale their businesses and brought that systems change mindset to the Sorenson Impact Center, where she tackled equity in education and entrepreneurship. And number three, a multilingual leader and former professor of entrepreneurship, Fred brings a global perspective and a deeply human approach shaped by her international upbringing and recognized through honors like the New Zealand Edmund Hillary Fellowship. Fred, you have been called many things: a champion for women entrepreneurs, a strategist for social change, and a storyteller reshaping how history is told. Today, we are thrilled to call you a chief influencer. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited. It's so weird hearing all those things, right? Like you wake up one day and you're like, all those things did happen.
And what's really cool about your background, I mean, it spans entrepreneurship, academia, nonprofit leadership. And I'd just love to start by asking what drew you to lead the National Women's History Museum? And how has that move shaped your understanding of influence?
Well, interestingly enough, I was recruited to consider this position. So to be perfectly honest, I was not even thinking about the nonprofit leadership space. I really love the for-profit entrepreneurship space in general. And I always assumed, wrongly so, now I know so much more, but I always assumed that in order to make the biggest change, that was where I needed to be. I didn't understand the power, for example, of boards and the commitment that board members can have, the access to their experiences, like the level of learning. So, yeah, it was one of those things where I'm so excited to be here, but I certainly wasn't, I'd love to say it was strategic, but it was really more reactive.
Well, so much of life is like that, isn't it? It's like you kind of know which direction you're headed, but it's impossible to know what opportunities are going to arise. And I love that you shared that, because sometimes people see someone successful at the helm of an organization like that, and they assume that, you were 14 years old and you said that was your dream job, but that's not exactly how it worked. What was your dream job when you were younger?
So the common thread in everything I've ever done has been this desire to empower women. And I didn't know those words when I was a kid, right? But it just, even as a kid, it started very early on to kind of tick me off that women had never been this, or women weren't recognized as that, or that it took until, however long for women to get access to their own credit cards or sign up, So no matter where I was, and actually I started my career at 22 in management consulting. And so even then I was like, why aren't there more women partners? Like, let's organize. So I think my dream job, honestly, I always wanted to be an executive CEO, always wanted to lead something. I assumed it would be by building something myself, which I did. But what I never understood or had really appreciated was the value that can come with moving into something that is well established, and kind of the brand value, the platform that you don't have to build from scratch. If you're willing to recreate something, meaning like redesign a strategy and come in and do all the hard work. So I always saw myself leading something, just not in the nonprofit sector for some weird reason. Maybe because I grew up in DC and it felt like that's what every woman was doing.
Yeah.
Awful thing to say, but like that's kind of what it looked like to me as a kid. So.
Well, and you mentioned empowering women and obviously leading the National Women's History Museum. I mean, what a great way to fulfill that dream,
Yeah.
even though you couldn't put it into those words back then. You mentioned sort of coming into an organization, an institution that has a history and a brand and equity in that way. So what's interesting about the National Women's History Museum is some people are very familiar with it, and that's why the brand is strong. But even if you aren't, and you just hear that, the National Women's History Museum, you think, well, wow, that sounds important. I mean, even if you don't know what it is exactly,
Yeah.
but a lot of people, there might even be confusion. I'm excited for you to unpack it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The museum played a key role in advocating for the Smithsonian's new Women's History Museum on the National Mall.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could just walk us through that advocacy and really what that moment meant for your organization so folks can understand the unique role each organization is
Yes.
currently plays and will play.
Yes, 100%. And this is before my time, but I am always delighted to tell this story. The National Women's History Museum started in 1996, and it was literally started by women who learned that there had been this beautiful statue commissioned and built on the women's suffrage movement that had been gifted and presented at the Capitol. And the next day, it was moved into the basement, where it then stayed in the crypt, which is just a fancy word for a basement, for like decades. And so these women were like, that's ridiculous. And they had started working to get it back to its rightful place. And along that process, they realized that there's very few monuments, museums, none at the time, just, things honoring women's achievements. And so they decided to start the National Women's History Museum with their goal first to get the statue back upstairs from the basement, but very, ingrained in that was, and we are going to get a physical building for women's history in Washington, D.C. That process took, 25 years, between 20 and 25 years. Thousands of people supported that initiative, from Meryl Streep, who's still a big supporter, to longtime donors who've been with us for 29 years. We're one of the only organizations that had to pay for our own commission research report to prove that it was necessary. And we spent a lot of time trying to articulate why women's accomplishments should be more mainstream and not just, an afterthought or something that you have to go find. What's interesting, though, was that while they were doing all of that, simultaneously, back in 1996, they were like, well, in the meantime, we are going to start addressing this by putting everything online. So actually, inadvertently, what happened is they became a digital-first museum because they wanted to be highly accessible to anyone in the country because there's so little women's history. And they actually became one of the largest digital-first kind of entities for women's history. Now, finally, in December 2020, Congress approved the legislation that said, which we had actually initially drafted, and said, yep, okay, fine. We agree. There should be a women's history museum. And by the way, there should be a Latino history museum. And we think it should be under the auspices of the Smithsonian. That way, it'll get federal funding. It can have a space on the mall. So in that moment, what happened is that Congress essentially created two entities. And the National Women's History Museum, I'm sure I wasn't there, but was somewhat disappointed because they had hoped, to be able to just continue this effort. And they had spent all this time and money really kind of working very, very hard to make that happen. But I think it didn't matter. Today, it doesn't matter. Today, we're so proud to have made that happen. And we're so delighted that it will one day happen. But you're right that it does create confusion. And so since December 2020, the Smithsonian has started the process of moving towards a physical museum. And if you go to their website and you look at their mission statement, I don't know the exact words, but it says to put a physical women's history museum on the mall of the on the Washington Mall. Okay. So that is their key objective. When I came on board 2 years ago, I mean, I'm not a historian or a museum person. As I told you, I never even run a nonprofit. And I said, well, what do you guys want me to do? And they said, we want you to think about a new strategy for how do you take everything that's been here now for almost 30 years. And for lack of a better word, I often say, figure out, Fred, how to put the national in National Women's History Museum. Meaning, if they're going to be the centralized solution here in Washington, build the decentralized strategy for women's history for the rest of the country.
Yeah.
That was interesting to me because that means I'm not trying to build a brick and mortar building. I don't have to do that. I can leverage technology, innovation, distribution channels. I can bring exhibits into unexpected spaces. I can completely reimagine how to bring women's history across the country without also having to without having to build a building. So that's the difference. So
I love that. Well, one thing that strikes me is that obviously digital is such an important part of strategy today, but many museums that have been around for a long time have to figure out how do we take our brick and mortar and then figure out how to translate it, to a digital strategy. And you're able to sort of start from scratch in a way. As you mentioned, you've embraced being a digital first institution. I wonder if you could share a little bit about how you've identified your most important audiences and, how that impacts your strategy to reach people, underlining the word national, as you said.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, when I first came on board, that was what they asked me to do. And with any organization, the first question that you want to ask is, what are we trying to do? And I always start with really simplistically asking myself, well, okay, I understand what you guys are telling me. There's very little women's history taught in, our textbooks and our K through 12 curriculum. It's about 15% of everything we teach is about women, and half of that is in a domestic capacity. So really only 7.5% of what we teach is even about women's accomplishments today. So I'm like, I know that stinks, but so what? Like, what is I never approach a question and say like, I wonder what the impact could be if I did more of this. I always start by saying, what's the consequence of not? And when I started that question, I began to understand the consequence was that when you don't teach women's history, little kids, girls and boys, grow up thinking that, oh, that must be because women's roles were secondary to men's. And then that thought kind of sticks with them, and it doesn't stay in the classroom, of course. It follows them into their careers and boardrooms and science labs and everything else. And unfortunately, girls then start perceiving how they view themselves differently, and men start thinking of their capacity and capabilities differently. Nobody's fault, just kind of what we were taught on the early onset. So the way that shows up in our world is called, it's measured by the World Economic Forum as the gender parity gap, and which basically is like gender representation. So how much gender representation do we have in this country versus all the other countries in key areas? And just as an example, according to the World Economic Forum, the US is 106 years away. So my first thought was, all right, so if I really double down on a strategy and start thinking about how we move the needle, the long-term impact is going to be contributing to shrinking that 106-year gap. And then my next immediate question is, all right, well, who do I have to focus on the most in order to make the greatest impact and change in the shortest amount of time? One of the things that actually is a differentiator between us and the Smithsonian is that, contrary to the Smithsonian, because we don't receive federal funding, because we are not under the Smithsonian umbrella, we don't have to be all things to all people. We're a private entity. So we can answer the question, who are we focused on the most in order to make the greatest impact now? And so what we decided, and when we kind of, again, like we worked on this with a wonderful team, and we said, okay, we have always supported the educators because they have never had access. We provide biographies, lesson plans, for educators by educator training models for the teachers in the classroom. However, we were also going to focus on their students, of course, but those same students outside the classroom. So I always say we have two audiences, the educators and the students 5 to 30, Gen A and Z right now, in and out of the classroom.
Or
And while that may seem like, oh, great, you've already got one covered, the truth is education has been just changing so much. And I don't even mean like the institution of education. I mean how kids learn. If you ask somebody today, how do you read a book? Where do you get your news? All these things, like, I don't have to tell you, like, this is your space, right? Everything is changing in terms of that age group. And so that's a very long way of saying our target audience is the teachers and their students and those students outside the classroom.
Well, it's kind of a good segue to talk about how you then reach those audiences. And I know, you have a campaign. She's not a footnote, and neither are you, which I love the second part of that in particular because it makes it relevant to them. And I wondered if you could just talk about that campaign, but also what inspired that particular message, and how do you measure success when you're trying to reshape narratives that have been ignored for a very long time, far too long?
Right. Okay, well, let me start by telling you a story.
Okay.
We have this amazing longtime donor. His name is Malcolm, and he's 92 years young. And he is so sharp and just a pleasure to interact with, talk to, and everything. So one day he called me and he goes, Fred, the ship is sinking. And I was like, okay, Malcolm, what ship are we talking about? And he goes, the ship, Fred, the proverbial ship, like the world, like the ship is sinking. And I'm like, oh, well, yeah, like we've got some issues. I agree. But why are you calling me? He said, because I have a proposal. And he said, I would like for you and several other nonprofit executives from around the country to get together and determine what is the biggest leak. And I was like, what do you mean? And he goes, he said from his perspective, he goes, I'm tired of funding the leak pluggers, meaning the things that are stopping the water temporarily. But I want to know, what is the biggest leak that is causing our overarching ship to sink? And he goes, and I'll pay you guys each for your time. And I was like, this is awesome. I love it. And so we got together from coast to coast on a regular basis, and we started just from researchers to PhDs to professors to other nonprofit executives, and we just started talking about this question. And it is fascinating because no matter where you start, you might say like, well, the biggest leak are, public policy, or the biggest leak is health. Like, no matter where you started, we always ended up in one place. And that leak basically was the representation of women at the table, any table, meaning it is that simple. If half your population is not present trying to solve any problem, whatever problem you care about, you're operating with your hands tied behind your back, right? And so the biggest leak is the urgency of the underrepresentation of women. Now, I was like, oh my gosh, that's interesting. Does anybody know that this is a problem? So I actually worked with, gosh, what's the name of the company that is it the folks that do a survey across the country? Not Omnibus,
Gallup.
not Gallup, but very similar.
Okay.
And I said, we want to put out one question. And the question is, how many years away do you think we are from gender equality or representation, whatever, equal gender representation? This was in October 2024. So we were in the middle of a presidential election, and we had a woman who was running for president, right? So I thought, well, we'll see what happens. First of all, 54% of respondents said women already have equality in this country. And I was like, oh, interesting. Of the ones who didn't think women already had equality and full representation, when we asked them, well, how many years away do you think we are? Knowing that the answer is 106 years, the average number was 33 years. So then I was like, oh, snap. Not only do we have not only do we have an issue, which is, we need everybody at the table again. Like, forget this is not political. This is not anything. This is just like, get your best talent to the table to solve whatever problem you care about. Climate change, education, healthcare, whatever. So then we hired a company to build us what's called a cause campaign. And a cause campaign is different from just a marketing campaign or a development campaign. It's like the example they used when I was learning about it was, Go Red for Women's Heart,
Right.
or Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And so I said to this organization that we hired, I said, look, you need to build me a campaign that resonates deeply with this audience that I'm now trying to target, this, young Gen Z and Ayers, but make it highly interesting and fundable by corporations. And it took a while. We had to do focus groups and so much research. And at the end of the day, where we landed was on this concept called she's not a footnote, and neither are you. And the whole premise is that these women who have done these extraordinary things were not footnotes. Like, they sometimes were the headline, certainly part of the story. And that became like the name, of the campaign. The cause, of course, is to address the urgency of the underrepresentation of women. The how is by setting the stage around the problem and then beginning to re-educate people. But again, we have to do it in ways that are really fun. Like, otherwise,
Yeah.
Can you imagine if I show you a picture of a bunch of women in bonnets? You're going to be like,
Although they just made that great new Suffs musical, and they made it so entertaining. The music's
it was
great, right?
excellent. Yes. So maybe that's not fair, but.
This episode is brought to you by the George Washington University's College of Professional Studies. With in-person and online programs ranging from master's degrees in public relations strategy to certificate programs in digital communications, GW offers more than just the credentials to help working professionals get ahead. It prepares them to be leaders in their field. Check out cps.gwu.edu for more information. No, but you gave a good point. You can't just read picture of the women in bonnets. You have to take that time frame and make it, relevant to people
Totally
today. And I guess I'm wondering, as I hear about, first, love she's not a footnote, and neither are you. I just love that. Like, that just says so much. It's so relevant to your audience. And as I hear you talk about that process, I'm just wondering, you are an entrepreneur yourself. You started your own business. And I'm just wondering, how did your experience as an entrepreneur influence your approach as a leader? And particularly, I feel like I can feel it in that campaign a little bit, but I just would love to hear kind of how you perceive your entrepreneurial background influencing how you're showing up in your role.
A lot of what I learned or I apply in this role stems from the fundamentals of business and specifically entrepreneurship. And the biggest lesson I think exists in entrepreneurship is that it is my job, it is your job, it is all of our number one job is to listen to the market. And so part of what I have brought from that here is a willingness to try some more, try a little bit of this until we kind of hear that the market is resonating. and then you turn up the dial. So as an example, when I came in, one of the first things the board said to me is, we think we need to relaunch our whole website. And I said, boy, do I agree. But I am not ready to do that until I test a little bit what our market will respond to. So I know this is my market. They're Gen A and Zers. They're definitely not going to respond to that. But what will they respond to? And so this campaign, She's Not a Footnote, gave us a chance to build almost like a mini brand around this new campaign, but also around this new strategy, and to begin to see how it lands. And that, I think, feels very entrepreneurial to me, rather than just spending the next 3 years doing market research and hiring museum branders to do it. No, like, so that's I think what carries over.
The idea of testing maybe a minimally viable product, right? That
The market.
campaign is almost like your MVP,
Yes,
listening to the market about what they care about.
exactly. Yeah.
Maybe, when you're talking about She's Not a Footnote, it's really taking the stories of real people, of women throughout history, and then making them relevant to people today, people in your target audience, 30 and under. I'm a big believer that, faces are the new logos, that brands of all kind have to find ways to elevate their people to break through. Because if we look at the trends, whether it's TV or TikTok or, anything in between, LinkedIn, we really see that the faces, the real people and stories are what resonate, that authenticity. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you've done that personally, because I know you're very active on LinkedIn, for example. And so you're not just representing your organization through the museum's brand and logo, but you've done that through your own brand, and you continue to. So maybe share a little bit about your approach there, because a lot of leaders are trying to find their footing when it comes to their personal brand, particularly on LinkedIn.
Look, I will tell you, I think I have a long way to go, to be perfectly honest. In part, the bit about your question that has always been my Achilles heel is that as a human, I personally don't love the idea of being the face of a brand. That's why when I launched herCorner, it was herCorner, not Fred's Corner, right? Like, it was always, but I completely agree with what you're saying and how things have shifted and how you have to meet the moment that we're in. And I think I have a long way to go. What I can say is my approach is to emulate what resonates with me. And so anyone, not just, the next generation, can spot authenticity from, something not even AI written, but something that is like messaged. And so what I have always tried to do on LinkedIn and on social is actually to stay true to my one narrative, which is about women. And it doesn't mean I only tell you about women in politics or women in this. Whatever I'm talking about, that is the narrative. Like, wow, this is awesome. Like, this woman got, XYZ medals or, oh my gosh, look, this prime minister of this country changed these laws to, right? So that's kind of been the baseline for me, is to start by saying, like, that's my thing. And so I'm always going to talk about it. I will say that I know what resonates most. People like seeing you on there as the leader of an organization, connecting and talking over video. People love not just knowing you were at a conference or honored at a conference, but like, what were the 3 things that you learned because you were in the room and they weren't, or they couldn't be, or whatever. And I think that that's what certainly I need to do more of, and perhaps others who are in this process need to do more of. But like I said, I still have a long way to go. And the only thing I can say I think has worked so far is just being true to kind of my one thing.
Well, you're very humble because you do a great job already. But I think, we all are seeing that it's an evolving ecosystem, and that, we all have to try different things. And it's been great through Chief Influencer just to hear so many senior leaders, mostly CEOs, talk about what's working for them, what's not, adapting. And there's some friendly peer pressure among all of you chief influencers to learn from one another and to, continue to each
Yeah,
push ourselves forward because, we all believe in our missions, right? And you're deeply committed to the mission of empowering women. It's something that, has been important to you since early days. And
great.
so building your brand to pursue that mission and to, elevate that mission among others it's important. So I think it's really great for leaders to hear how you're prioritizing that and, being humble about how, you said you have a long way to go, but you're already doing an excellent
Well,
job
I
from
will
my.
say I'm very excited to come to your event next week because I want to hear what others have to say.
Yeah, we're doing, it'll already have happened by the time people listen to this, but we're doing some really cool events where we're bringing chief influencers together on panels to share their expertise. And we're really excited about doing that and just getting the word out more because we all have the power of influence. It's just embracing that we do. And then the key to unlocking it, I really believe, is what you said, authenticity. You know, people don't want to just read a press release or something, talking point somebody wrote for you. You have to find that human touch, and that's different for everybody. And
Yeah.
I think that's something that you do so well, and that's a thread that goes through so many of the things that you've been a part of. Um, Speaking of the many things you've been a part of, can you tell us a little bit? I mean, first of all, you've lived and worked across cultures. You speak multiple languages. You were named a New Zealand Edmund Hillary Fellow. I want to hear a little bit more about that fellowship, but also just how global and multicultural perspectives have shaped your vision for, whose stories get told and how they're told.
Well, the how they're told is what I love the most about my job because it's changing and it's so fun. I met a guy the other day who has performed at the Kennedy Center, and he's like DJ hip hop mixtape maker, where he takes history, kind of like he worked on the first Hamilton like official mixtape. Um,
Cool.
so how stories get told is just like, it's so fun and cool. Um, so let me tell you about the Global Impact Fellowship, because I can't even believe I got into this thing. So in New Zealand, they have a brain drain issue because they're a tiny island at the bottom of the globe. Years ago, they decided, well, we're going to go out across the world and we are going to find the top kind of people in impact, whether they're entrepreneurs, investors, or connectors. Those were their three categories. And we're going to, well, they're going to come to us, and we're going to assemble them in New Zealand. So give them a good reason to come and connect here in New Zealand and collaborate on whatever area. It could be the oceans, could be the regenerative farming, it could be space, it could be whatever it is. And so I applied to be part of this fellowship because I was like, this is amazing. I mean, Tim Ferriss is in this thing. Like, it is just awesome. And they were like, yeah, okay. Well, we went through all the thingamabobs, and then they were like, you're in. And I was like, sweet. So it has given me the most interesting front row seat to what my colleagues are doing around the world in areas that I never get to think about, whether that's aerospace, whether that's, again, like so much on the climate side, everything to do with food regeneration, like just and of course, like my area is like gender parity and representation, but then that also allows me to work with people who are working on indigenous rights, and then you get into indigenous rights and you start learning from people who are working on like the rights of rivers and mountains, and like protecting the plant, and like you start to understand that there are people in certain countries that are changing laws to provide rights to rivers, and those rivers then get trusts so that those trusts can be funded so the rivers can defend themselves against companies polluting them. I mean,
Wow.
it's awesome. Like, it is just amazing. And so that has, my family and I, we moved to New Zealand in 2018, 2019 for a year. And this has been a wonderful way for me to stay connected with a country that I just feel so deeply connected to, because they are not only so far ahead than we are in impact, and I'm not even beginning to kid there, but they lead with kindness and inclusivity as a culture. And it's just a pleasure, honestly, to be given this opportunity to go there. I was just there in February, and not just learn, but to just spend time with people that they have picked from all over the world, to be part of this. So
That's amazing.
It's
Thanks for
awesome.
sharing about that. I mean, obviously you light up when you talk about it and it's an incredible experience and you can see how you've brought that, lessons from that, to the work that you're doing today.
Yeah.
Um, I want to ask you, I know we don't have too much time, but I have two more questions I want to ask you, Fred. One is just, what do you hope a student, maybe somebody who's never even set foot in a physical museum will feel after experiencing the work of your organization?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's pretty straightforward. Whatever experience you come into with our work, whether that's a physical exhibit, because we do what's called museum and residence programs, where we bring physical exhibits to unexpected places. So, like the next one's going to be in a public library in the heart of Atlanta, where kids will walk in every day. So, it doesn't matter to me whether you experience like a physical exhibit or you see something on social or you hear one of us speaking or whatever, in whatever experience you have with the National Women's History Museum. I want, I hope deeply that what people walk away with is a sense of optimism or of opportunity or I can do that or, a shift in paradigm, something that they walk away feeling like, oh wow, I didn't know that. Huh, maybe I can do that. Or maybe she
Mm.
can do that. Or I should tell my daughter about this. You know what I mean?
I love that. Yeah. And it kind of underscores the importance of having ways to tell those stories
Right.
that complement great physical exhibits. Museums are important, but to inspire that optimism more broadly, because, you can only touch so many people through a physical
Yeah.
exhibit, right?
Can I
And just
tell
thinking
you?
about your,
Yeah, well, can I tell you, like, the next thing that's coming out with our campaign that I'm really excited about?
please.
We are doing these 2 look, the most important thing to do is I have to start by getting somebody's attention, not trying to immediately, like, dump knowledge into their brain about the suffrage movement, right? And so, we hired this incredible creative firm and said, "Make us 2 videos that can go over social, that can go all sorts of," and their job is just to create curiosity, not to teach.
Yeah.
And so there's 2 of them coming out, June and July. And the first one is called Refers to. And it's about all these women who invented these incredible things like the double helix and discovered black matter. But history refers to them as this dude or her husband, or, like literally they've been erased. Like nobody knows who these women are. The other one is called WTF by the National Women's History Museum. Who's that female?
Ah, I love that.
And it's actually about women in STEM that you don't know, and, like, the whole thing is, like, that's some BS right there, bad science, right? So, it's meant to be playful and bold and have you, like, watch it and be like, "This is hilarious," and Rachel Harris is the voiceover actor that does it. It's just funny, you know?
So,
And I'm not trying to make people mad. I just wanna get people to think something's funny and be like, "Oh, that's interesting."
yeah. Well, because we have to catch people's attention and entertain them nowadays, right? And I think your background in entrepreneurship and your global perspective and what you get that.
Yeah.
That has to be such an important element of influence.
We'll see if it works.
I can't wait to hear. Well, I want to close with one last question about the topic of influence. And this is a good transition, I guess, from WTF, who's that female? But you said that one of your influence superpowers comes from your mom. What did she teach you?
Well, so let me just set the stage. My parents were both immigrants to the United States, and my dad was an entrepreneur, and he worked a lot. He had French restaurants in the DC area, and he worked, Friday night, Saturday night were his busiest days. And my mom also worked full time at the French embassy, and so we had a routine, which was that Friday night we would go. She'd be done with work, and she'd take us to the grocery store. And as a reward for going to the grocery store, she'd then take us to McDonald's for dinner, which was a big deal when your dad is like a French chef.
Yeah.
So, anyways, we would go and sit down at McDonald's, like in the booth. And every Friday night, my mom would say, "Do you know what happened this week?" And I'd be like, "No." And I'll never forget, like the one example I can give you is it was 1980. I was 6 years old. And she goes, the Shah of Iran died this week. And I was like, who's the Shah? And like, what's the big deal? And what my mom taught me there that has stayed with me my entire life was how to make any story accessible, right? There's nothing worse. I remember when I was in business school and I'd get so annoyed with the guys in my class who were like, I'm going to go to Wall Street and work in finance. And I'd be like, you mean finance?
Yeah.
It's the same nonsense, right? Like, just, I remember my mom saying to me, like, okay, Fred, the Shah of Iran, think of it like the cat in French, the Shah, and he just died and he made a big difference because he tried to modernize Iran. And a lot of people got mad because they thought he was too close to the United States. And so he was exiled and he died in a whole different country. And like, she made it so real and simple.
Right.
And I was 6, right? But I now do that all the time. When somebody, a historian or a scholar or somebody's talking to me about somebody, I'm like, okay, so explain it to me, but give it to me like, usually they just explain it to me. And then what I do is I'm like, so this is what I heard. And I retell the story because I love telling stories. I love being like, I bet you've never heard about, Maria Tallchief, who's on a U.S. quarter. Do you know that that woman was the first Native American woman to perform as the prima ballerina for America on the stage as Native American? Like, and she, or like all this stuff. But I don't know. I'm not going to remember the facts and the facts and the facts. And that's okay. Right. But I think somebody might hear that story and go, the first American prima ballerina was Native American? That's amazing. So anyway, so that's a superpower. Like, just keep it simple, right?
Well, I think what you get to there is storytelling has always been an important way to communicate, right? But increasingly, it's tougher to break through. So it's even more essential. And what you're doing today in your day job that you learned from your mom when you were a kid sitting in the booth at McDonald's learning about what happened to the Shah of Iran is how to take a lot of complex information and translate it into a story that someone else is going to care about and someone else is going to see themselves in and that's going to resonate and that they can, remember it. And that ties so perfectly into the campaign that you landed on for the National Women's History Museum. She's not a footnote and neither are you.
Right.
And it just is so, I don't know, cool for me and for those listening to hear that connection from your childhood through your career and then landing where you are now and watching those lessons put into practice in a way that we can all think about, oh, how are we telling stories that are centered around the people that we want to reach so that they care? And how do we make that information accessible? And how do we leave people with a sense of optimism when we do it, which you said is one of your goals. And for me, a big takeaway is just, you said same thing that we should all be doing comes from entrepreneurship. It's about listening to your market and then knowing how you can respond to that.
That's the most important job. And the worst thing about that is sometimes you do everything perfectly well and you have the most beautiful campaign and the most beautiful message and the most beautiful brand. But sometimes the market doesn't meet you there.
Yeah.
And that just happens, right? That just happens sometimes. So I'm hoping that's not what's going to happen here. But
yeah. Well, and then as, the author, Ryan Holiday says, the obstacle is the way. We have to confront that obstacle and learn from it.
Yeah.
And then that obstacle turns into the path that gets us to the next step. Because if the market hasn't met us, then maybe for all our effort, there's something different. Well, maybe they got it wrong, but maybe we have to adapt to help meet them where they are too. I mean, right? It's a little bit of.
Yes, 100%.
And that's tough. And so, but that's what influence is all about. And that's why you are a chief influencer. And I just so thrilled that you made time for us today because I think it's so important that folks know about the National Women's History Museum and know what's happening on the Smithsonian and how your digital first institution, after making that happen and getting the ball rolling on that, is thinking about how you can meet people wherever they are, whether that's in the library in Atlanta through a special exhibit or online, through the
Exactly.
various techniques that you've developed and that you are rolling out to do that.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a great conversation today, Fred.
Awesome. Thank you. Take care. Have a good rest of your week.
Chief Influencer is a production of Social Driver. We help clients transform complexity into clarity with people-centered strategies. Whether you're looking to elevate the influence of your brand or of your leaders, check out socialdriver.com to learn more. For show notes or to nominate a guest, visit us at chiefinfluencer.org or follow Chief Influencer on LinkedIn.